So let's get started with our discussion of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Shirley Jackson was born in 1916 and lived until 1965, so she was still relatively young when she died. She is most well known for writing horror and gothic stories, ghost stories, things of that nature. One of the texts she's most well known for is The Haunting of Hill House, which has since been turned into a Netflix series. She wrote The Lottery in 1948, and that time is going to be really important because a lot is going on in American society at that time. World War II has just ended, and people are trying to create sort of a new normal. And that's going to affect the lives of all American citizens. When Shirley Jackson wrote The Lottery, it was published in the New Yorker, and the reaction to the story was resoundingly negative. She received over 300 pieces of mail, almost all of them talking about how her story was horrible, was pointless, was outrageous, was inappropriate. Even her mother, even her mother wrote her a letter, and she basically said, darling, I love you, but really, did you have to? So let's talk about what's going on in the story and why it caused that reaction. Okay, so here's our general plot diagram. We get a little bit of a description of the town at the very beginning. It's a small town and it's a summer day. School has just been let out and all of the people of the town are coming to basically the town center. So everybody is gathering and we're introduced to some of the main characters. We meet Mr. Summers, who sort of is in charge of running the lottery. We meet Bill and Tess Hutchinson, who will become important later on in the story, and we meet a few others as well. The conflict or issue here is the lottery itself. There's some evidence that we need to rush through the lottery. Now, generally, when we are told that a lottery is going to be held, we tend to associate the lottery with very positive things. But throughout the rising action, we start to notice some things that make us uncomfortable. A couple of the things are the way in which the children, especially the boys, are gathering piles of stones. Another thing that might make us uncomfortable is the way in which the men are kind of standing off to the side, and the author says they smiled, but they didn't laugh. So throughout the story, all of the citizens get into family groups. So a family group is anybody with the same last name. So if your last name is Smith and you have 3 adult sons, they're all going to be in the same family group. Your daughters, when they marry, draw with the husband's family. So all the family groups get together and they start drawing. Each family group, the head of each family, usually the eldest male, draws from the black box. And at the end, when every family has drawn, the head of the household or the head of the family opens up their slip of paper. And the person who has received the black spot wins, sort of. So the winner is Bill Hutchinson. And at this point, his wife Tess, who has been sort of joking and laughing this whole time, starts to get really angry. She says, "You didn't let him pick the one he wanted. You forced him to choose that one. We need to start over." But they don't allow it. They all tell her to calm down. At one point, her husband tells her to shut up. And then, because theirs is the only family group in that family, each individual person within the family, Bill and Tess and their 3 children, have to draw from the box. So 5 slips of paper are put back into the box, and one of them has the black spot. They all go through and draw their sheet of paper. Mr. Graves helps little Davy Hutchinson. Davy is 3 years old, and he luckily is not the winner. We learn that Tess Hutchinson is the one who wins. And at that point, this is our climactic moment. This is the part where she starts screaming. She says it's not fair. And every member of the town goes and picks up a rock or stone. They gather in a circle around her and they stone her to death. This is sort of the falling action of the story. The falling action and resolution is all one. What's interesting here is that everybody in town must take part, even little Davy Hutchinson. So let's talk about the story's setting. At the very beginning, in the very first paragraph, the author writes, "The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with a fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock." So ignore some of the typos here. And notice the way I quoted. Notice that there's an introduction to the quote, a comma that separates the introduction from the quote itself, quotation marks around the quote at the beginning and the end. Notice that you do not need quotation marks around each sentence, just at the beginning and the end of the quote. Then I have a parenthetical citation. Because the author's last name is not in the introduction, it needs to be here in the citation. And because there are no page numbers provided, I then need to provide this little note here. It says para. That's an abbreviation for paragraph. This quote appeared in paragraph 1 of the story. After the parenthetical citation, I have a period. So this is just a quick review of quoting rules, quoting do's and don'ts. Okay. So here we have this beautiful summer day. How does this setting help to set the tone? Well, because it's a beautiful summer day, the reader is led to believe that this story will end happily, that this is maybe even a story about love or romance, or because it's titled The Lottery, somebody winning something. And so you're sort of lulled into this false sense of security. The other thing that you get is the sort of lack of information. We are not told what state, what region, what city we're in. And the author leaves that information out on purpose. The idea is that this kind of thing can happen to anyone, anywhere. Okay, so let's talk about the narration. We know that you can have a first, second, or third person narrator. In our last two stories, the yellow wallpaper and the cask of Amontillado, we had first person narrators, and both of our first person narrators were unreliable. In this story, you'll notice that you have the he, she, it, or third person narrator. Another thing you might notice is that we don't get any thoughts and feelings from any of the characters in the story. This means that what we have here is a third person objective narration. And this is our first and only short story that features the third person objective narrator. This is going to affect the way that we feel about the story. Most importantly, what we note here is that because we don't get any thoughts and feelings, we don't really understand why they're doing what they do in the story. Why are they stoning one person to death? What is the goal here of this act of violence? What is the reasoning or the purpose? We do have Old Man Warner say something like, "Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon." So there's some implication that it has something to do with the crops, but we don't really know for sure. What we know is that they've always done it, and because they've always done it, they are going to continue to do it for the rest of their lives, basically. All right, so let's look at some of the characters. One of the characters I mentioned was Old Man Warner. Notice his name, Old Man Warner. He who warns. That's his job, to warn. A couple of the characters, most notably Mr. Adams, say things like, "Some of the towns have stopped having the lottery." And Old Man Warner says, "Pack of young fools, nothing's good enough for them. Pretty soon we'll all be living in caves, eating chickweed." So he is like this kind of sort of like, you can sort of imagine like your elderly grandfather or your like old curmudgeonly uncle, that kind of character, who creates this kind of slippery slope argument that if we stop doing the lottery, bad things will happen. If we stop doing the lottery, we're all going to end up in caves. If we stop doing the lottery, we're all going to be eating nuts and chickweed. And he kind of represents the resistance to change. Mr. Graves stands with Mr. Summers near the black box. What's interesting in this story is that Mr. Graves never says a word. He stands at the top of or next to the box in front of the crowd. Everybody must walk up to him. He even helps little Davy take a piece of paper out of the box. Mr. Graves, notice the name, Grave. He basically, when people walk to him, they're walking towards their grave. So he sort of represents death here, the sort of quiet, constantly looming possibility of death. And then you have Mr. Adams. So there's lots of biblical imagery in this story. Notice that Mr. Adams is the first person to draw from the box alphabetically, and that Adam is the name of the sort of first man biblically, historically, biblically. And Mr. Adams is also the first person to suggest getting rid of the lottery. So remember that in the Bible, Adam sort of sins against God by going against tradition, going against the rules that we don't always understand. Don't eat from this tree. Why? Doesn't matter. This is tradition. Don't do it. And Adam is the first person to sort of challenge that tradition. Or rather, and in the story, Mr. Adams is the first person to challenge that tradition. There's some really important symbols in the story. The first is the black box. Notice that the black box is all kind of beat up. Some of the paint has been stripped off. You can see little pieces of wood hanging off of it. And also notice that except for during the ceremony, during the lottery itself, it's kept sometimes in a barn, sometimes underfoot in the post office. It doesn't seem to have any real value outside of the lottery. And yet, none of the townspeople will allow Mr. Summers to build a new one. It says they don't even want to upset that much of the tradition. So that here shows us how important the idea, the concept of tradition is to this town. It's important to follow tradition. That's it. Not understanding why we have the tradition, just following it. Notice that this tradition, this symbol of tradition, the black box, sits on a three-legged stool. This is another biblical image. Much like the Holy Trinity, this stool has three legs. So the three-legged stool represents the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, in other words, religious tradition. So this box sits on religious tradition. The symbol of tradition, the box itself, sits on religion. And this kind of is a comment on the author about how sometimes we do things because they become a part of religious tradition, even if they don't serve us, even if they don't serve our community, and even when we don't fully understand them. The stones are another really important biblical symbol. So, for example, in the Bible, in John chapter 8, verse 7, Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Well, we know that stones are used as a form of punishment in the Bible, and almost exclusively they're used as a form of punishment against women. Women are the ones who are often stoned. And in fact, stoning is still a popular form of punishment against women in today's society. And just a couple of years ago, there was a story of a woman who was basically convicted of adultery. She was actually the victim of rape, but in their culture, any sex outside of marriage was adultery, and she was stoned to death by her community. So this is just giving you some insight into the story.